Our next speaker is a best-selling author of the book American Icon, which is really a book that chronicles Alan Mulally's turnaround at Ford Motor Company. Ford was in a position where probably as close as any company has come to bankruptcy. And the amazing job that Mulally did at Ford in turning that business around was chronicled in this book by this author. Now, interestingly, this author is not only a reporter, and was a reporter for 22 years, he was not only a reporter in Silicon Valley, he was a reporter in Detroit, and he owned the automotive industry, which in Detroit is a pretty big deal. The thing that impresses me the most about this next speaker is that he's a Dale Carnegie graduate. And Dale Carnegie changed his life. When I sat down with him for lunch, he told me, he said, you know, I took a Dale Carnegie course, and I went into this course, and I got to tell you, I wasn't really all that excited about it. He was doing it really as a favor for Ralph Nichols, who he knew. And Ralph had kind of, can you imagine Ralph twisting someone's arm to take a Dale Carnegie course? So he takes the course, and he comes out of it, and he said to me, you know, what I discovered was I really didn't like who I was. And I also thought that I had a bigger vision for myself. And so he actually changed and left reporting and ultimately became a consultant and is now doing some amazing work with the US military, with other companies. He's done some work with us at Dale Carnegie. And one of the things that was really neat when we talked about Dale Carnegie, after he took his Dale Carnegie course, he said, oh my gosh, when I look at what Alan Mulally did in turning around this company, I see Dale Carnegie all over it. And he asked Mulally, he said, were you a Dale Carnegie graduate? Mulally said, no, I wasn't. But Mulally talked about the impact that Dale Carnegie had on him. And that's what our next speaker is going to be talking about. Please welcome up Bryce Hoffman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to ask you all a question, and I'd like you to answer honestly. In this room, have had someone come up to you and ask you, Dale Carnegie? Is that still a thing? Does that still exist? Well, I was, as Joe mentioned, I was one of those people. You know, in 2012, when my book came out, American Icon, Alan Mulally and the Fight to Save Ford Motor Company, like most authors, they all do this, even if they say they don't. First thing I did, first day, was look at the bestseller list. see who my competition was, see where I was at, and I was glad to find that my book was there. But I also noticed on that list of best-selling business books was How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I said to my wife, can you believe that's still in print? I thought, I'm amazed. I didn't even know that was still around. Now, that was the book. Forget about the course until, as Joe mentioned, I met Ralph Nichols, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I want to talk to you now about how I learned that Dale Carnegie is alive and well very much in the 21st century, and I want to share with you a story that I think will show you and will give you ammunition to answer people who ask you that question, that will show you, yes, in fact, it is as relevant today as it was 100 years ago. If anything, it is more relevant. So, let me tell you a short story here. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but I want to start by laying the groundwork here, telling you a little bit about the Ford Motor Company. You all know the broad outlines of this story. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile, but he is the man who turned it from a rich man's toy into a means of transportation for the masses. And in doing so, he, along with the other American automakers, created this tremendous engine of prosperity that drove the American economy to levels that became the envy of the world, that created a standard of living in the United States that was beyond what anyone else could even dream of. Unfortunately, Ford, along with GM and Chrysler, along with their executives, along with their employees, came to take that success for granted. Instead of viewing it as something that they had to go out and fight for and win every day, they decided it was their birthright. And what happened as a result? Over a period of 50 years, from 1960 to 2010, the share of the American automobile market that belonged to the American automakers collapsed. It went from almost 100% to less than 50%. That would be bad enough, but that's only half the story. Because as the share of the market that belonged to Ford and General Motors and Chrysler collapsed and contracted, they did not. They kept thinking, we just have to figure out how to get back to 1965 again and everything will be wonderful. You know, as soon as we can convince people that tail fins were a good thing after all, we can get this, we can win. But that didn't happen. And so as a result, all of these companies ended up with too many factories, too many employees, too many dealers, too generous contracts that had been negotiated in better times. Worst of all, though, they retained a belief that they were too big to fail. I mean, you would hear people at Ford and at General Motors say, when asked, how are you going to get through these tough times? I don't know, we'll figure it out, we're Ford. I don't know, we'll figure it out, we're General Motors. General Motors, that's all you need to know. Well, unfortunately for them, it wasn't all they needed to know. But Ford had a whole set of problems in addition to those that were all its own. They were cultural problems. They were problems that had been with the company for a long time and had just gotten deeper and deeper and deeper because you had a really caustic corporate culture at the top of the house in Dearborn, Michigan. You had a company where people put their own careers and their own divisions ahead of the success of the company as a whole. Let me tell you just one concrete example to prove what I'm talking about. In the early 2000s, Ford's Asia Pacific Group was working on a game-changing small car. They knew it was going to be game-changing because Ford had never built a really good small car. They had it now. It's the car, by the way, that's on sale today as the Ford Fiesta and is widely heralded as one of the best subcompacts in the world. But when it was under development, the head of Ford's Asia Pacific Group, what did he do? Did he go into a meeting with his peers around the world and say, I've done it, my team has cracked the code, we've got a game-changing small car that's going to make us competitive again? No. What he did was he went to his engineers and he said, I want you to change the design of this vehicle so it can't pass US safety tests. Because he didn't want this vehicle to be able to be sold in the United States because he knew that if it was, that it would really give a big boost to Ford in the United States. And that might make Ford's Asia Pacific operations look a little less wonderful by comparison. That is just one of many examples that show you just how poisonous the culture was at this company. And it wasn't an exception, it was the rule. When the head of Ford of Europe walked into a boardroom, the head of Ford's Americas Group would get up and walk out, even if it was a meeting with Bill Ford Jr. And if the head of Ford's Americas Group walked into the room, the head of Ford of Europe would get up and walk out. They could literally not sit in the same room with each other. So in addition to the collapse of the entire industry, Ford was a company that was killing itself from within. Its biggest competitor wasn't Toyota or Honda. Its biggest competitor was Ford Motor Company. And I'm not going to bore you with a lot of numbers, but I do want to just show you some really quick. This is what Ford's share of the US market looked like from 2003 to 2006. And it doesn't take an advanced degree in math to know that this was the result of their finances. So, in case you can't read, that's more than $12.5 billion loss there for 2006. Now, I want you to imagine that you're Bill Ford Jr., the great-grandson of Henry Ford, and you're sitting in your corner office on the 12th floor of Ford's world headquarters building in Dearborn, Michigan. And you can see the steam rising up out of the Rouge factory complex that your grandfather created that became the model of manufacturing in the entire world. And there above your desk is old Henry's painting looking down at you. I talked to Bill and asked him what was he thinking. He told me what he was thinking was, I'm going to be the guy who loses this whole thing. It's going to die on my watch. Everything that my family created, everything that our employees created, everything that our workers created, it's all going to come to nothing, and it's going to happen with me in charge. And so he reached out and he tried to hire the rock stars of the global automobile industry to help him save his company, and they all told him no, because it was the view worldwide that Ford could not be saved. It was done. It was finished. It was only a matter of time before the bankruptcy papers were filed, so nobody would come work there. He went after Carlos Ghosn, the CEO of Renault Nissan. He went after Dieter Zetsche from Mercedes. All of them said, no, we don't want anything to do with this, Mr. Ford. Your company is done. So what did he do? Well, he hired an aerospace engineer from Seattle to save his car company, Alan Mulally. Now, who was Alan Mulally? As I said, he was an aerospace engineer. More importantly, he is the man who had saved Boeing, not once, but twice, from almost going out of business. First, from its decades-long battle with Europe's Airbus, which almost bankrupted the company. And then second, from the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which resulted in most of the world's airlines canceling their orders for new planes the next day. I mean, imagine that. You're all in business. Imagine every single one of your customers calls up tomorrow and says, you know what, that Dale Carnegie training, sorry, count me out. That's what happened to Boeing. And yet Alan managed to save the company. So Bill Ford knew that here was a guy who had been through the fire and had proven that he could do it. Now, another fact about Alan, he was also a proud Lexus owner. I remember, as Joe said, I was a journalist at the time, and we were all summoned to Ford's world headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan at the end of the day, September 6, 2006. And one of the first questions that Alan got during the press conference was, Mr. Mulally, what sort of car do you drive? And he said, I drive a Lexus because it's the best car in the world. And Bill Ford reached over and grabbed the microphone away from him, and he said, and it's being keyed in the parking lot as we speak. Alan laughed and he grabbed the microphone back from Bill and he said, it's okay. We're going to make Fords just as good. And that's exactly what he went on to do. Because right there, he did something that had not been done in the American automobile industry in decades. Two things, actually. First, he told the truth. Because this was an industry that had been lying to itself for decades. Starting with the lie they told themselves that Americans don't like small cars and they'll never buy these cars from Japan. To the second thing that he did, though, was he gave people hope. So he told the truth. He ripped the bandage off, but he said, don't worry, we can cure this. It's not over. Now, there's a fourth fact about Alan that's important to understand. We're going to talk about this more later, and Joe already touched on it. That's that he was a student of Dale Carnegie's. So, as I said, radical stuff. Alan went to work, and he created a simple 4-point plan to save his company. This is the entire plan. Now, this might seem like common sense to you all as entrepreneurs and business owners, but I assure you this was a radical manifesto in Detroit in 2006 when this was announced. Because none of these things were done by any of the American automakers. Restructure to operate profitably at the current demand and changing model mix, they couldn't do that. They had union contracts that required them to keep producing cars whether people wanted to buy them or not. Build cars and trucks that people want? They didn't do that. They built the cars and trucks that the bean counters let them build and that the union was willing to produce. Finance your company and improve your balance sheet, they didn't know how to do that. And they certainly didn't know how to work together effectively as one team, as we've just discussed. But Alan didn't just come up with this plan. He and his team rapidly began to implement this plan. They went to the union, the United Auto Workers, and they negotiated a game-changing contract that allowed Ford to profitably produce cars in the United States again for the first time in decades. They began a product renaissance that turned Ford's lackluster product lineup into the envy of the global automobile industry. The Ford Fusion that they introduced, which I've pictured here, was rated by most of the world's automotive press as the best compact car in the world when it was introduced. Just as amazingly, though, they came together as one team, working together to solve the company's problems, not with a new leadership team, with all the same executives that had been there before for the most part. And finally, they financed their plan, taking out what Alan likes to refer to as the largest home improvement loan in history. $23.5 billion. $23.5 billion that they borrowed by mortgaging not only all of their assets, not only all of their factories, not only all of their distribution centers, not only all of their intellectual property, but by mortgaging the Ford name itself. Now, when people heard that at the time, a lot of people thought, oh, that's just kind of window dressing to show how serious they are. Let me tell you how serious that was. At the time, I had a good friend who was a vice president at JP Morgan, which was one of the banks that underwrote this $23.5 billion home improvement loan. He told me that within 2 weeks of this being announced, that he had calls from half a dozen Chinese automakers saying, if Ford defaults on its loan, sign us up. We'll pay whatever you want for that logo. We'll slap it on all of our cars and sell them as Fords around the world. So this was a real, serious make or break move to save this company. But the most amazing thing that they did, and keep in mind when this is happening not during a boom economy. This is happening against the backdrop of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. They did it without taking your money, or your money, or your money, or my money. Ford saved itself. It became the only American automaker to pass on a government bailout of the automobile industry. And we all know what happened. As Ford's crosstown rivals went bankrupt and were only saved by a government bailout and bankruptcy, Ford fixed its problems itself. And the American people and people all over the world rewarded it. Look at these. Again, I'm not going to bore you with a lot of numbers, but you got to be stunned to see this turnaround. And again, keep in mind, this is not happening against a boom. 2009, 2010, the economy, you were living this. These were hard times. But look at that rocket-like rise. And by the way, the only reason why you see this big decline here is because this big peak was Ford cashing in all of the tax credits it had hoarded for years as a last desperate move in case they could cash in all at once to get one more year in business. Well, by 2011, they realized they didn't need to have that reserve, so they cashed them all in. So it really is an amazing story. I want to fast forward last summer, Alan Mulally retires from Ford Motor Company. The company's got record profits, dividends are restored, the company's brand image is restored. It's viewed as the most admired American manufacturer. But that's not all that they accomplished. They also changed Ford's culture, creating this one Ford culture that had created the environment for the company's future and sustained success. It really is an amazing story. It's one of the most amazing turnarounds in business history. But you might be asking yourself, well, what does this all have to do with Dale Carnegie? Well, so as Joe alluded to, my book came out 2012, and a few weeks after it came out, I got a call from Mr. Ralph Nichols, and he said, can I buy you breakfast? And at the time, I was getting a lot of calls from people like that. And so I wasn't so sure. But he said, I know Alan Mulally. We're friends, and I want to talk to you. So something about his voice, his persistence, his enthusiasm made me say yes. And over breakfast, Ralph explained to me that he was the co-owner of the Dale Carnegie franchise in Southeast Michigan. And I told him my story about how I discovered that How to Win Friends and Influence People was right up there with my book on the best-selling business books. And he very generously said, you know, I think what we teach, I think what Alan did at Ford and the way that he did it really exemplifies what we teach. And he said, look, you're in a position now where you're giving a lot of speeches and a lot of talks. He says, I'd like you to take this class on me. Talk about that spirit of abundance that Joe was talking about earlier. So I signed up. And I took the course. And Mark Will is sitting here. Unfortunately, Joe's not here today. But Joe and Mark and I went out to lunch. Do you remember this, Mark? Yeah. All right. We went out to lunch. Mark bought. And I was only a third of the way through the course when we went out to lunch. And Ralph said, well, what are you thinking of it so far? I said, I love it. It's changing my life. And every principle I'm learning, I'm thinking to myself, that's what Alan did. That's what Alan did. That's what Alan did. So I want to show you what I mean. Let's take the basic principles here. Don't criticize, condemn, or complain. 6 weeks after Alan Mulally was hired as CEO of Ford Motor Company, he came down to the Detroit News, my paper, to have his first sit-down interview. And the first question we asked him was, Mr. Mulally, when are you going to get rid of all these jokers? When are you going to get rid of all these knuckleheads that ran this company into the ground? When are you going to get rid of these people who were so stupid they couldn't save this company? You know what his answer was? I'm not going to get rid of anybody. I'm not here to cast blame for who's responsible for Ford's problems. I don't care about that. I'm here to take Ford Motor Company flying and make it successful again. And I believe that Ford has the talent it needs to save itself. I mean, think about how easy it would for him to make himself look good, to come into town and say, I'm here to save the day. These guys couldn't do it, but I can do it. No, he didn't do that. He said, you know what? I got a great team here. And I believe that most of them are going to understand what I want to do and help me save the company. And I don't want to spend 1 minute talking about how Ford got into this mess in the first place. I don't want to spend 1 minute talking about who was responsible. And during his entire tenure at Ford Motor Company, he never once talked about who had been responsible for Ford's problems. Never once. So that's principle number 1 in action. Principle number 2, give honest and sincere appreciation. That is something that Alan Mulally did every single day at Ford Motor Company. I never once saw him. And I spent, from the time he was hired until the time I stopped covering Ford to write my book in 2010, and then I spent the next year working with him very closely, 2011, I never once saw him go out of his office without giving appreciation to a Ford employee. And not just to the employees. Not just to the employees. That's the amazing thing. Let me tell you a story. In 2007, spring of 2007, he summoned, and you guys are franchisees, a lot of you here, so you're going to appreciate this story, I think, because Ford also runs on a franchise model. Ford's dealers are franchisees. And they were not happy with Ford Motor Company. And they had a lot more reasons than Lotus Notes not to be happy with Ford Motor Company. So you know what Alan did? He invited them all to Detroit. Now that might seem like punishment to some people, but trust me, this was a He invited them all to Detroit, and fortunately for him and for Ford, the Ford family owns the Detroit Lions, so he had a place to put them, which was in the bleachers of Ford Field. And there were thousands of them. Every Ford franchisee in North America was there. And on the field were not the Detroit Lions, but Ford's entire North American sales staff. And Alan walked out into their midst, and he looked at all of the thousands of Ford sales staff, and he said, I want you all to turn around and face the people in the stands and tell them you love them. Now people were like, I love you. He said, no, tell them you love them because they are the ones that are paying your paycheck. They are the only reason that you have a roof over your head. So you better love them because you haven't been loving them and you need to start loving them now. And everyone turned around and said, we love you. It was like they were Dale Carnegie graduates. You talk about showing honest and sincere appreciation. That, I submit to you, is probably one of the best examples ever of that in action. But Allen didn't just stop there. A month later, he summoned Ford suppliers to the same stadium because the suppliers were not happy either, because Ford had been squeezing them for years to get another few 2 or 3 cents out of every part to try to stay in business. And he had Ford's purchasing people turn around and do the same thing and tell them, we love you. And he said, you better love them, because if they don't give you good products, we're finished. So that's honest and sincere appreciation in action. Now, arousing that eager want. You know, negotiating that game-changing contract with United Auto Workers was not an easy task, as you can probably imagine. So how did Allen do it? Well, in the spring of 2007, he held a secret meeting with the president of the United Auto Workers, Ron Gettelfinger, the guy in the blue blazer there, and his subordinate, Bob King, the head of the Ford section in the yellow shirt. He had a secret meeting with them at the Dearborn Inn, a hotel in Dearborn near Ford's world headquarters. And in the room, he had an easel. And on the easel, he had Ford's entire product renaissance plan. Pictures of all the new cars that he wanted to build. And he showed them. He showed them to Ron Gettelfinger and Bob King. He created an eager want, you see. And then he told them, this is how we're going to save Ford Motor Company, with these cars and trucks. It's a shame we can't build them in the United States of America. Because I'd really like to. I'd really like to build them in the United States of America. But right now, I'd lose money if I did that. And as you know, because he opened the books up to the UAW, as you all know, I don't have any money left to lose. So he said, unfortunately, most of these products are going to have to be built in Mexico. Unless you're willing to work with me to figure out how to change the rules of the game and make them profitably in the United States. And he walked over to Ron Gettelfinger. I talked to the union side about this. They told me the same story. He walked over to Ron Gettelfinger and he said, Ron, will you go out with me in front of all the news cameras and tell everyone that we figured out how to do this? That we figured out how to save American manufacturing? Or if you don't want to, I understand. We can call a press conference, we can tell everyone we tried, but it was just too hard. We couldn't do it. Viva Mexico. So he created an eager want in the United Auto Workers, and he got a game-changing contract as a result. Become genuinely interested in other people. This picture here, I think, tells the whole story. This is Allen sitting down with an actual Ford customer filling out his loan application. The CEO of one of the largest corporations in the world. And guess what? This was not a photo shoot. This was not a photo shoot. This picture was taken by a Ford employee. Allen spontaneously went around to dealerships when he had a free moment. When he would go into a town for a business meeting, he'd pop into a dealership and say, can I have a name badge? You see he's got a badge on right there. He'd go out on the floor and say, hi, I'm Alan Mulally. What sort of car are you interested in? What can we get you in today? The CEO of one of the largest companies in the world doing that because he wanted to see what customers felt. He wanted to see how they experienced Ford Motor Company because he was genuinely interested in other people. You know, I'll tell you a story. This is a true story. Right before I left the newspaper, we gave Alan Mulally an award for everything that he'd done, Michigander of the Year, for being the business leader of the year in 2010. And there were other recipients at this award ceremony. There were awards for philanthropy, for community work. And two of the other biggest business leaders in Michigan were also at this dinner. Dick DeVos, the head of Amway, was there, and the head of CEO of Domino's Pizza were there. And I was standing next to Alan, and during the cocktail party, they were just staring over, looking at him like, hey, Alan Mulally, hi. Dick DeVos here. He completely ignored them. He spent the entire cocktail party talking to a nun and a Muslim woman who was doing interfaith work in Dearborn, Michigan, who were both getting awards for their community service. The entire time he spent talking to them. And as it got time for dinner, I reached over to his assistant. I said, Alan's spending all his time talking to this nun and this Muslim woman. What about all these big titans of industry here? And she shook his head and said, he could care less about them. They don't mean anything to Ford Motor Company. These are the people who buy his cars and trucks. These are who he wants to talk to. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. He left the meeting donating a van to the nun's soup kitchen. And the Muslim woman walked away with a coupon for 20% off a Lincoln. And that's Alan Mulally in action, taking a genuine interest in other people. He also asked both of those women to autograph his program because they were getting awards for community service, which he thought was more important than his award. Now, what's number 5? Enough said. I'm going to tell you, I asked the same assistant I was just talking about, Karen Hampton, his primary assistant. When I was working on my book, I said, Karen, tell me the truth. Was there ever a time when Alan was really just in despair? I mean, keep in mind, you guys remember what was happening during this period. You know, I said, was there ever a time when he just was like hanging his head low? And she said, there was one time, and I was like, aha, I finally got it. She said, yep. One day, 2009, in the midst of the crisis, when we only had enough money left to stay in business for 3 more months and had already passed on our government bailout, I walked into his office, and he was looking out the window squeezing a stress ball. And I said, oh, crap. Should I get my resume out? And he said, no, why? And she said, well, if you're sitting there squeezing a stress ball, then we must be about to go out of business because you never get stressed out. And he said, oh, I hurt my shoulder playing tennis this weekend. He never came to work without a smile. I never saw the man without a smile, and I have never met anyone who can tell me a time when they did. He always had a smile on his face, and that's a powerful thing. He told me that he saw, well, actually, I started referring to him after his first year in office there as Ford's cheerleader-in-chief, and one day he and I were talking, and I brought that up, and I said, are you mad at me for calling you that? He's like, no. He says, that's a big, important part of my job, is reminding people that, you know, this isn't all doom and gloom. We can fix this thing. We have to have a good, positive attitude if we're going to do that. And he said, that's my job, is to be the cheerleader-in-chief. And to do that, he had to smile. Alan calls everybody by, this guy has the most amazing memory for names. I have been at restaurants with him where he remembers the name of waitresses that at a restaurant he hasn't been to in 2 years. And not just people's names, he remembers something about everybody he meets. He goes up to Ford employees in factories and says, hey, did you go fishing again this year? You told me last year about that marlin you caught. Did you go fishing again this year? It's amazing. He does this all over the world. And it's a powerful thing to see it in action, to see the pride on people's faces when the CEO of their company walks in and he remembers their name and calls them by name. He called every journalist by name too, which, you know, influenced people. I had a positive view of him because he remembered my name, because he always asked how my dad was doing. You know, he knew that my dad had been so inspired by him, what he was trying to do at Ford, that he, for the first time, not bought a Lexus and traded it in for a Ford. You know, so he'd say, hey, how's your dad's Ford doing? Is he still like that? Does he need another one? What's it going to take to get him to drive home in one today? It really was an amazing thing to see. And the other thing that he did was listen. One of his personal mantras, one of the codes that he lives by, one of the most important things he told me that's a secret to his success is seek understanding before seeking to be understood. Seek understanding before seeking to be understood. I mean, that's principle number 7 in action, right? And it's exactly what he did. He didn't come into Ford Motor Company saying, boy, you guys, you couldn't do this. Let me show you how it's done. No, he came in saying, you know what? I want to hear your best ideas. And he didn't just say that to Ford senior executives. He said it to all of Ford's employees. And it wasn't just PR. It wasn't just making employees feel good. It was real. It was real. I'll give you one example. An engineer who'd been at Ford for 20 years and was getting ready to quit because he was so frustrated that no one would listen to his ideas about how to improve the company's products. 2 weeks after Alan was hired, sent him an email saying, early in my career, I used to work at Boeing too, Mr. Mulally. And I remember you there, and I remember that you were a real engineer once. He said, we are incredibly inefficient in the way that we design our vehicles. Here's one example. We use different hood latches on all of our cars and trucks. We could use 1 or 2 different designs, save a lot of money by commonizing, take complexity out of the situation, have fewer warranty claims, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody cares. I've told this to people for years, nobody cares. 2 hours later, he got a call from Alan Mulally saying, can you come up to my office and bring your schematics? He did. He brought an armful of blueprints up. They laid them out on Alan's table. An hour later, he walked out of the office heading up a special task force to redo the way that Ford designed those parts of its vehicles. That's being a good listener. We also know that it's important to talk primarily in the other person's interest. So when he went to the UAW, as I told you, he didn't go saying, this is what Ford needs. You must give us, you must cut your wages. You must cut your benefits. He went to the UAW saying, look, you want to ensure a future for your employees in the United States. I want to build cars in the United States. Let's figure out a way to do this together. Let's figure out how to make you successful and your members prosperous by helping us to be successful as a company. And he did the same thing with Ford's franchisees, and he did the same thing with Ford's dealers. You know, when he took over a lot of Ford stores, I don't know how many of you had shopped for a Ford car before 2006, but a lot of their dealerships looked pretty bad because many of the franchisees were making so little money that they weren't painting their dealerships, they weren't putting in new carpet, they weren't cleaning the bathrooms, you know, things like that. So one of his priorities is we have to change the image of Ford Motor Company, and to do that, we need to make our dealerships look like a place somebody wants to go and buy a car. But that was going to cost a lot of money for dealers, right? So instead of just telling dealers, you know what, you guys don't know how to run your franchises, you know, let us tell you how to do it and just send us a check for the proceeds. No, he went to them and he said, look, I want to help you be successful. You want to sell more cars. You can't sell more cars out of a dealership that's made out of corrugated steel. I'm willing to give you low interest loans to help you finance a top to bottom, you know, refurbishment, remodeling of your dealership. And I'll even waive the interest if you do this right now, et cetera, et cetera. And I guarantee you that this will help you become more prosperous too. Dealers signed up all over the place for this. And he did the same thing with suppliers, speaking primarily in terms of their interests. He said, look, you don't like us because we nickel and dime you to death, and we won't give you long-term commitments like Toyota will. So here's what I'm going to do for you. If you give us your best technology, we will give you long-term, decades-long commitments. And we won't haggle over price anymore as long as you give us your best price to start out with. Ford went from being rated the worst American automaker to do business with by the suppliers globally to being rated the best in just the space of 2.5 years, because Alan talked primarily in terms of the suppliers' interests. It benefited Ford too, but he talked in terms of their interest. Finally, point number 9, make the other person feel important. You know, the person who's in this picture is the first time that I saw this in action. Derek Kuzak was the first personnel move Alan made. He promoted this engineer, this very soft-spoken engineer. He made him Ford's first global head of product development. And I can remember the night in December 2006 where he introduced Derek to the media at a dinner. And he walked out and he pulled Derek next to him just like he is in this picture, except he had his arm around him. And with his arm around him, he said, "This is the guy who's going to help me save the Ford Motor Company. This is the guy who's going to turn our products from being boring to being great. This is the guy who's going to do it. Talk about making another person feel important. And he did that every time he was in the spotlight, he was constantly pulling other people into the spotlight with him. You know, I remember when the new Ford F-150 was introduced in 2008, he called out some designer who was just a mid-level designer and said, I want to bring Jim here. Jim is the guy who designed these wheel arches here. Look at how big they are and tough they look. Jim did that. He really made people feel like they were contributing. And not just employees, he did it to dealers, he did it to the suppliers, he did it to unions, he did it to the community leaders in places where Ford had factories. And it really worked. Now, I could go on and on. How much time do we have? Anybody? Time check? Okay, I'll just keep going. Okay. What? Okay. So I'm not going to keep going in that case. There's a lot more. And during the question and answer session, if you want me to talk about how Alan lived and exemplified any of the Dale Carnegie principles, I'd be happy to do it. But I'm going to just skip through here so that we have time for questions. The question that Joe posed. How did Alan know this? How did Alan understand these principles? Was he a graduate of the Dale Carnegie program? I asked Ralph when I had this lunch. Mark was there. And Ralph very modestly said, I don't know, because I don't want to ask him. I don't want to put him on the spot. Well, I don't mind putting people on the spot. So I asked him. I picked up the phone and I called him. I said, Alan, are you a graduate of the Dale Carnegie training? He said, no, I'm not. But when I was 12 years old, I got a copy of the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And he said, I read that book cover to cover, not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, dozens of times. He told me that book became like the Bible to me. He said, that book changed my life. And I think that you can see in the examples that I've just given how he put the principles in that book into practice. So next time somebody asks you, is that still a thing, Dale Carnegie? Is that still relevant? Tell them about Alan Mulally and the Ford story and show them just how relevant it is today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I hurried up so that we'd have time for some questions because I want to seek understanding, not just seek to be understood here. And I know I did the other first, but I know it's important to listen too. So I'd welcome any questions or comments that you all may have. There's a microphone in the back, but there's also mobile microphones. If you don't feel like walking to the back, just raise your hand like this gentleman here, and somebody will bring you a microphone.
Oliver Crom. I really appreciated your presentation.
Thank you.
One comment. Dick DeVos is a Dale Carnegie graduate, as is his partner. And as a result of taking the Dale Carnegie course, he got the courage to start Amway.
Thank you. Thank you.
A question.
What's your name?
Baron Johnson, Tampa, Florida.
Thank you, Baron.
Question. I've read a lot about him, and he's mentioned as well by Marshall Goldsmith. Do you have a story maybe or a brief example of how he handled direct conflict? Because it still happens no matter how much we apply these principles. We avoid a lot, but it's still going to be there. Do you have a case in point where he really came head to head?
I do. I've got several, but I got one really good one. It involves that guy who changed the design of the Ford Fiesta so that it couldn't be sold in North America. So, as I told you all, Alan said, I'm not going to come in here and fire people, but what he did say is, I'm going to invite people to join the team. And what I have found in my experience is that most people will rise to that occasion. Most people will join the team, but not everybody will join the team. And he says, I find, based on my experience, that those people will find their own way out of the company. So the head of Ford's Asia Pacific group, when Alan explained to him that he was going to change the way the company was going to be run, they were going to have a weekly meeting of the senior leadership team. And at that meeting, instead of sitting around and blaming each other for the company's mistakes and trying to stab knives into each other's backs like they were habituated to do, they were going to get together and just calmly and soberly look at the data on how the company was operating in its current direction and figure out how to adjust the courses necessary to hit their strategic objectives and goals. So the head of Ford's Asia Pacific group said, that doesn't work for me. He said, I have things to do. We're trying to open factories in China. I have to have meetings with Communist Party officials. I can't be coming to Dearborn and having meetings here. And Alan said, well, that's the way we run the company now. Didn't say it he didn't yell at him. He smiled. He said, that's the way that we run the company now. He said, I'll tell you what, you don't have to attend our BPR meetings. It's all right. It doesn't make you a bad person. Literally, he told me this. He said, doesn't mean your mama doesn't love you. He said, but you can't be part of the leadership team if you don't. So that's all right, we'll find another job for you. And he offered him another job, and he chose to leave the company. He self-selected out of the company. So that's the way that Alan handles. He's the proverbial iron fist in the velvet glove. You know, whenever he describes his leadership model of working, he calls his leadership philosophy working together. But he's always quick to add, it isn't warm and fuzzy. It's not a plush toy. It's a way of working together that's effective. It's not designed to be touchy-feely. So he does things with a smile. He never raises his voice. He never yells. But believe me, you don't want to be the person who's consistently not being part of the team. Yes, ma'am.
Bryce, I have a question. I am the proud owner of a Cadillac, and I heard that apparently you can get 20% off a Lincoln. How do I get a ticket for that?
You know, unfortunately, I'm not Alan Mulally. But enjoy your Cadillac. Any more questions? Anybody? Yes. Yes, sir. How did the Dale Carnegie course change my life? How much time do we have? So, as Joe mentioned, when I took the Dale Carnegie course, I was a journalist, obviously, financial journalist, had been for about 22 years. And two things. First of all, in addition to inviting me to take the course, the other thing that that Ralph said to me, and Mark said it too, was, why the heck are you wasting your time being a journalist? Aren't there more important things to do in the world than just sit and highlight people's mistakes and shortcomings of companies and things like that? And that really got me. It got me thinking. And after I wrote my book, I came back and I felt like I'd already done everything that I could do with, that I'd wanted to do as a journalist. And so with the encouragement that I got from taking the Dale Carnegie course, I decided to quit my job and become a full-time management consultant, because I was getting a lot of requests from companies all over the country and the world who'd read my book and wanted to use the principles to change their cultures and their companies. So that's the first way that Dale Carnegie course changed my life. But the other way that it changed my life, before I took the Dale Carnegie course, I thought that the fact that I knew that I was a jerk made it okay. I mean, I thought that the fact that I was hypercritical of people I worked with was okay, because I was even more critical of myself. I thought that the fact that I was critical of my wife was okay, because I was even more critical of myself. And I thought that the fact that I knew I was a critical person made that all okay. And when people would point out to me just how critical I was, I'd say, well, that's all right, that's who I am. Well, I learned from taking the Dale Carnegie course that that's not all right. And that saying that that's just who I am is really just a cop-out. And so I learned how to be a nicer person. And as a result, a much more effective person, too, by taking the Dale Carnegie course. So it really did change my life.
What message should we be saying to people in the C-suite to help them see how much we can affect their organization, particularly if they think, is that still around?
I would share with them some of the stories about how Alan changed Ford Motor Company and show them, make the connection, show them how, you know, this idea of how he reached out to the UAW, I mean, because that's a great one, because people know, anyone in business knows what a Herculean task it was to get the United Auto Workers to agree to get rid of thousands of their members, to close factories, to give up benefits that they'd struck for years, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, now Ford's learning just how hard it is to get them to keep giving those up. Share with them that and tell them how Alan used the Dale Carnegie principles to do that. How this is a real example of speaking primarily to the other person's interest, of appealing to people's nobler instincts. Because that's the other thing he did. You know, he didn't go to the UAW and say, let's do this for your members and my bottom line. He said, I'll never forget this, because this was the first sign I had that this guy was different. The question I asked Alan at the first press conference the day he was hired, because in the 20 minutes it took me to drive to Ford's World Headquarters, I had an assistant reading in my ear as much of his bio as she could get together, you know, on 5 minutes notice. And one thing has been really clear to me, he's passionate about Boeing. He devoted his whole life to the company. So the first question I asked him is, I said, Mr. Mulally, I understand that you've devoted your life to Boeing, that you're passionate about aviation. Why are you leaving Boeing and coming to Ford Motor Company? And he said, that's a great question, because you're right, I am passionate about aviation, I am passionate about Boeing. He said, but you know what, there's something I'm more passionate about. He said, I believe America should make things. He said, I am here to fight for the soul of American manufacturing. And that gave me chills when I heard that. And he meant it. He meant it. And when he went to the UAW and asked them to make these sacrifices, he did it with that by appealing to their nobler motives, saying, don't you, like me, believe that America should build things? I don't want to build these vehicles in Mexico. I have to, because I can't do it without losing money with the contract the way it is. And he showed them the math. He did an unprecedented thing. When he started negotiations with the UAW, he called the CFO of the company and said, I'd like you to give the books to the UAW. Now, that wasn't done. But he said, no, he says, let them pick any analyst. They can pick whoever they want. Pick any financial analyst in the world, we'll give them their books. Let them look at it and see if I'm lying to them about how bad things are. So the UAW hired a very left-leaning economist from Wall Street, who'd kind of gotten squeezed out of Wall Street because he was so left-leaning, to look at the books. And they thought for sure this guy was going to find that Ford was lying, that they had money squirreled away somewhere. He spent 2.5 weeks studying Ford's books, and he called up the head of the UAW. Ron Gettelfinger, real gravelly voiced guy, said, so, where do they got the money? Where are they lying to us? And he said, sir, I've looked at their books. He says, if they're lying to you, it's about how good they are. He says, they're worse off than they're letting on. He says, this company's about to go out of business, and if you don't work with them, all your members are going to lose their jobs. So I think if you just use that, that's a powerful example right there to show how using these principles could change everything for a company. Yes, sir.
If I may add a little more insight.
Please.
About being with UAW, it's one thing I've noticed that for 40 years of being a trainer at Dale Carnegie is that when we receive Dale Carnegie messages from other people, we respond. It's so wonderful beyond receiving it. And I suspect that Bob did too, because not only a graduate, he taught Dale Carnegie the Relevance Corporation and his logo. And he's responsible for 10,000 UAW members taking the Dale Carnegie.
Wow. There you go. Thank you. Is there anybody else? I think we are out of time here, but I really appreciate you taking the time to hear my story, and I hope it inspires you and gives you something you can answer to people next time they ask you that same question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
What's this? Oh my God. Great job. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Wow. Thank you. How about this guy? Is he living the Dale Carnegie principles or what?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.